Basically, Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. There's so much room for brands to add values to customers' lives, and I think part of the problem is just that we forgot about the value equation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Promote the Hell Out of It. My name is Misael Trujillo, and this is the podcast where I talk to guests worth promoting about subjects we should all be talking about. And as always, I've been excited to share today's guest with you all. I talked to Rosie Yakob, co-founder of the wonderful company Genius Steels. And if you've been following the podcast up till date, you'll know I had Faris Yakob, the other side of Genius Steels, the other co-founder, on the show a while ago, and we had an incredible conversation about the realities of digital nomad life. I had so many questions to ask Rosie after my chat with Faris that we set up this episode I am sharing with you all today. And we cover a lot of ground. There are travel tips and digital nomad lifestyle tips for those of you listening who are interested in that. But we also talk about her time working with hip-hop legends Jay-Z and Steve Stoute at their entertainment branding company, where she worked with companies such as Wrigley and Samsung, connecting fans in non-traditional ways. We talk about how companies can create culture and give value without obviously ever selling out, and we talk about the concept behind Genius Steals, how to steal ideas without copying them, and where to draw the line. I took so many notes during this conversation, and I really hope you all enjoy it and can find as much value in it as I did. I am also really excited because this episode is sponsored by Nextstand, a company we've been using and friends with for the last 6 months or so. They actually engineered one of the most highly adjustable and portable laptop stands on the market, which has been incredibly useful as a digital nomad, also useful if you're telecommuting or remote working, and they definitely help with my posture, which in turn helps with my productivity as my back doesn't hurt. So all the information for that is in the description below to all their different products, including a nice little discount code for you all. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with the wonderful Rosie Yakob.
Basically, Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Rosie, it is so wonderful to have you on the podcast. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to our chat today.
Oh, excellent. I had such a wonderful time chatting to Faris, and because of time constraints, we only got through half the stuff I wanted to talk to him about, which is always the case when you get on with someone, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, he always has such interesting things to say. I am just blown away by our conversation. I think it's really interesting actually because I think so much of relationship maintenance is that day to day, how is your day, and explaining what happened at work or what happened while you were apart from your partner. And, you know, Faris and I, now that we live and work and are constantly traveling together, it's this 24-hour relationship. And at the very start, one of the interesting things was like, okay, we can't have conversations about our day because you were there the whole time. If I saw a crazy person on the streets doing, you know, a song and dance performance, you also were there. If I saw a gorgeous waterfall, you also were there. And it took like sort of 6 months of active sort of trying and figuring out like, okay, wait, so what do we talk about when we're not just talking about what happened during our day? And of course, stuff comes up naturally, but then there are also those times where you just have a little bit of that silence, which sometimes can be golden and sometimes can be awkward. And I just remember one day in Vietnam, we were like 3 months into our travels, and Faris and I had this incredibly long, tedious conversation about the U.S. judicial system, the penal code, does jail work, all this sort of big picture stuff. And it went on for several days. Like it went on for 4 hours that night was the discussion, and we just kept picking it up. And I was like, okay, now I'm getting it. Like now that we have all this sort of basic relationship maintenance that we don't have to catch up on, let's now enter this new territory of this whole wide world of what are all of the things that we care about or we want to learn more about. And yeah, Faris's brain is like a trap. I don't remember nearly as much as he does, but that's not fair. I remember more people-based things, and he remembers more fact-based things. So I'm not surprised that you guys had he said it was a long, meandering, but wonderful conversation.
It is, and I think that's the best way. And it's funny because my partner and myself, who have been traveling for almost 2 years now, so nowhere near as long as yourselves, but we're learning as we go, and we're the opposite she is wonderful at remembering names and dates and information that I can never get my head around. And yet I can go on rants that last days about politics and how things can get fixed and problem solving. But that makes it fun, right? Because otherwise you're just seeing the same stuff all the time.
Yeah, one of my common refrains to Faris, at dinner or drinks, I'm like, so what happened on Twitter today? Which leaves a whole wide world of, conversations up on the table to pick. And it's so cool, by the way, that you're doing the nomad life thing. I always love hearing about more people who are, taking this sort of path and making it their own. And 2 years, like, I applaud you. That is a long time. I'm curious to know, did you feel like when did you feel like it got easier? Was there a point in time when you thought, okay, now we've got the hang of it, it would be easier to keep going than to stop?
To be honest, as soon as we started, we were like, this is easier than stopping. Instantly, because there's so many pros to it. I'd say it never gets easier for me personally. Yeah, at least. I'm hoping it goes round the curve. Yeah, I think instantly the pros outweigh the cons, but there's a lot of things that you need to be doing constantly that are new to life. For example, planning where you're going next and the
right.
Everything that comes along with that, right?
So many more decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something that Faris and I talked about. And I wasn't planning on starting here, but as we've touched on it, I would love some extra tips from you. Like, what is the main thing, other than what we've already touched on, that you find helps you travel as a couple?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think my perspective in life is that it's always about lots of little things rather than one big thing. And I do think that over the past 6 years, we've kind of figured out these small ways to optimize our life, which in turn optimizes our relationship because these things are so, intrinsically linked. I think everything from yoga, like just getting exercise, is helpful. Meditation has been a really great tool for us, sometimes to reset our minds, but also because Faris and I both have lots of opinions on things and enjoy sharing those. And sometimes when we work together, there are times when we have conflicting opinions and when we disagree on things. Of course, that's healthy. But we're both very emotional people as well. And neither of us have been great at separating work from pleasure and vice versa, which is perhaps one of the reasons this lifestyle suits us so well. But meditation has been a great tool too, to say like, okay, we've both set our piece. Let's do a 10-minute meditation and come back to this with a renewed sense of focus, energy, perspective, whatever it might be. I mean, ideally you can sleep on it. Sleeping on something is really helpful, but sometimes you need that short little opinion, that short little time to reframe your opinion. I think travel days and just being kind to yourself and going into the day knowing even if it's a 2-hour flight, there's a potential for your whole day to be disrupted. And I'm certainly an optimist. Faris is probably more of like a realist, but I think we both channel a little bit of stoicism, that like Marcus Aurelius idea of if you prepare for the worst, then you are, surprised by how well things can go. And if you
so true.
Yeah, go into the airport and you're going like, well, okay, we only got delayed 30 minutes. It could have been 5 hours. Like, then everything seems easier. So I think there's some of those mental hacks. And then also figuring out what drives you and being open to that changing. When we first started traveling, we were both driven by novelty. And I think to a huge extent, we still are, personally and professionally, driven by this idea of novelty more than familiarity. And we talk a lot about how this really can define people and their past and their lifestyles. But also, as we've gotten older and as we've, continued to travel, this nomadic life, we've really enjoyed getting to go back to places, in part because of some of the same things we just touched on, which is you don't have to make so many decisions or learn so much. Like in France, I know that they use the euro. I know approximately what the euro exchange rate is to the dollar. I know that I can get an Uber from the Marseille airport to Aix-en-Provence. I know that there are markets every day, but there are grocery stores. So just those sorts of things become, oh, instead of going to somewhere new that we've never been, we start to want to come back to places and find that that gives us time to have a little refresher, again, for work and for life and turn relationship thing.
Yeah, so relatable. We used Vietnam as our place to go back. We fell in love with Hanoi, and we spent a good almost 2 months there, and Chiang Mai.
I
And
love
Penang.
Chiang Mai.
Yeah, you find these places that you feel comfortable in, and I think there is this misconception that being nomadic means you're always somewhere new and you're always exploring, and I think you'd get very burnt out if that is the way you approached it constantly.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I guess the last thing I'll say on like relationship front is friends. Having friends is so important because you cannot get everything you need from one other person. And especially in the Western world, we really put a lot of onus on our partners. I'm not sure if you read the book, but you probably maybe at least are familiar with the cultural phenomenon of Eat, Pray, Love from Elizabeth Gilbert.
Yeah.
So TLDR, at the end of the book, she had fallen in love with this guy from Bali, and the guy moves back to the US with her. And she's kind of decided in her journey, like, I'm not going to get married again. Marriage is not for me. And ultimately what ends up happening in the space between Eat, Pray, Love and her next book called Committed is that he overstays his welcome in the US and essentially is going to be kicked out of the US. There's, no way for them to stay, except the only way for him to come back to the US is for them to leave the US for 6 months, to get married, and then to come back and live together that way. And so she basically says, okay, I'm going to spend these 6 months researching marriage. What is marriage? I am opposed to it. Why am I so opposed to it? What does it look like in different countries? Maybe it's different to me. And one of the things she finds is if you ask women in Southeast Asia and China and a lot of Eastern countries, and if you say, like, is your husband your best friend? They're like, no, are you kidding me? Like, my best friend is this group of girls. If we in the Western world, we're looking for our partners to be our lovers, our best friends, in some cases, our financial providers, our mental health support, the list goes on and on and on. And other countries don't put so much on the partner. So I think one thing that we can learn from the rest of the world is don't try to make your partner everything to you. And that's not to say settle. I don't want anyone to settle. I want everyone to feel like they found their Faris, the most perfect person in the world for them. But at the same time, I think that we can, give a little bit more leeway to our partners. And that comes from filling your life with other people who can satisfy you personally, professionally, that sort of sense. So, especially when you're working with a partner, Faris and I went from big agency jobs where we had teams of people reporting into us, or people celebrating the work that we did and our accomplishments, or friends who wanted to, buy you a drink when you get a promotion or a new job, or however it might be. So I think that's the other thing that we've really worked on in the past 6.5 years is building an intentional community, because having friends around the world is just that, friends around the world, which is great. But a community means, to us at least, that your friends from around the world are meeting and interacting with each other. And I think there's so much to be said for looking across the room and seeing your partner killing it, right? You see them engaged in another conversation or dancing or holding court over flip cup or beer pong or over a fancy cocktail at a bar in Shoreditch, wherever it might be. So I think that's the other thing, that we put so much into a relationship, and then there's so many outside forces that can positively and negatively impact this.
And it's so difficult to get that balance. And I find it so amazing that you've said this, because it's something that I struggle with. I'm from the Canary Islands, so that side of the family is so like your partner, your wife, your whatever is your everything. You spend every living second with them. And then England, which is the complete opposite of that, you kind of hardly ever see them unless you come home at the end of the night.
Right.
And they're both really difficult, opposing sort of things that you have to balance and find something that works. And when you're traveling, it's very easy for that to slip because your friendships can become so momentary. Like, you're in Hanoi for 2 months, you make friends, and that's it. Then you have to start again in your next city.
Yeah, so one thing that I think is really interesting about this, I read this book, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of it. No, Love and a Sense of Drowning just came to me right then, I think. This woman ends up going on an around the world cruise with her boyfriend on like a sailboat anyway, and she says one of the things that's super interesting about sailors is that they make fast friends, because when you land in a port, you're probably only going to be there for a night or two, and so they don't want to have these sort of surface level conversations. They want to dive right in. And when I read that, it really clicked with me, because I realized, now she says sailors always talk about the weather because this is a very crucial part to your well-being, is understanding the weather. But for us, I remember just how many conversations were about either the weather or living out of a carry-on bag or where we've been or where we're going or what's our favorite place to have been, or, you know, any sort of, you can kind of start to predict the way the conversation is going to go, some of the questions, and inevitably you have these rehearsed bits that just come out like a performance piece, because you're like, okay, yeah, I know where you're going with this question. I can fill you in 2 seconds. And of course it's entertaining sometimes, and I want to be able to share about our life, but it was also a little bit frustrating to feel like I'm having the same conversations, even if these people aren't, I am, but we're half of the conversation piece. So I just have started a Google Doc with a list of questions, and the questions range from, you know, the weird and the wacky to the personal to, you know, whatever. And I just now break out those questions, and sometimes it's inappropriate and sometimes it's funny, and but what I realize is, like, at least then I'm at least partially directing the conversation. I'll still answer the questions about living nomadically because I love it and I want to be able to share that, but at the same time then I can redirect with something weird. And Chuck Klosterman, he actually has a great set of these open-ended questions. So like one of them's like, if the world was ending and you knew the world was ending and everyone's like, the only people who are going to live are the ones who go on this spaceship, and you know that you're not going on the spaceship because it's reserved for like scientists and doctors and important political figures and et cetera, et cetera. You go to bed thinking like, tomorrow I'm going to die, but in the middle of the night you wake up to someone banging your door and they pull you out of the house and they take you to the spaceship, and you realize like, shit, I'm going to live if I'm on the spaceship, but I'm totally not supposed to be here and no one else has any clue that I'm not supposed to be here. Do you reveal that you were not supposed to be there and most, likely get removed from the ship? Do you immediately tell someone? How do you play that situation? And of course, a lot of people will have, well, what was my role supposed to be? Like, am I a doctor that is supposed to be performing surgeries later? Do we need another doctor? Is it something a little bit more soft skills? And even the contingencies or follow-up questions that people have about the scenario, I think are so revealing and so interesting. So yeah, I'm into asking my Uber drivers about their love lives and asking the baristas about what they think about Brexit, because I'm too bored of conversations about weather.
Yeah, and I get you. Although I love the idea you've mentioned of the list, because I have the opposite issue. My brain is working 24/7 and it goes in very deep thought. And what often happens to me is that in order to avoid the boring conversations that come up over and over again, I go really deep into politics or religion or the Brexit question like you asked. And sometimes it's the opposite. You find yourself getting in these conversations that are repeatedly just you leave it feeling angry and horrible about the world in general.
Well, okay, so that's interesting. So what do you think, how do you think being a world traveler or a citizen of the world or nomadic has impacted your perception on politics, if at all? Like, do you feel like you're more engaged, less engaged?
I've always been incredibly engaged with politics. I feel like the thing with me in traveling and politics is it's easier for me to talk to someone about politics from Vietnam or from Thailand than it is to talk to someone from England most of the time.
Interesting. And do you feel like I'm trying to ask it in a not a leading way, but I'm gonna fail at doing that. But
yeah, it's okay.
Do you feel like being exposed to different countries' politics has in turn, I don't know, maybe given you a little bit more respect for the politics of the UK, even if they're disastrous?
No, I don't think it has. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not even English. I'm Spanish, but both Spain and England, I feel, have their atrocities are. I feel that often we've grown up to feel like everywhere else is worse, and traveling has just made me feel that that's not true. That it's quite the opposite in most cases.
One of the things that has helped me is I have just realized over and over again that the people are not their government, or the people are not their politics.
Yeah.
We were in Brazil earlier for a speaking gig this year, and we were there for about 3 weeks, and it was just before their leader, I can't remember if it's a president or prime minister or whatever, had said, some disparaging remarks about gay people and how he wasn't very approving of gay people and didn't want them in the country or celebrating carnival or anything like this. And you're just like, okay, it feels very off-brand for Brazil, first of all. But beyond that, when we started talking to people, everyone was like, this is so stupid. We can't believe he said that. No one we know agrees with it. So I guess to me, that's been kind of the silver lining that I've seen. That and we haven't traveled to Venezuela, but I feel like traveling in general has opened me up to more world news, being an American.
Absolutely.
And coming from the American news cycle, we don't get a whole lot of foreign politics in our worlds. And I felt like, okay, now I'm seeing kind of, something like Venezuela. I don't understand how Venezuela can come back from the position where it is. So maybe it's possible. And I think, there's a whole lot to love about Venezuela. I'm not saying it's a bad country. It's just in a really, really shitty place right now. And it's hard to imagine something that could pull it out from that. I look at Trump and Brexit and I see situations that do not make me happy, but I see still, I guess there's the pragmatic version of me that still sees a way to move forward.
I relate so much to everything you've just said, and the only difference is my takeaway from it is kind of different.
Please, what is it?
So my takeaway is that I have more faith in a country like Venezuela because of what you said, because I feel like the people do not stand for what's being said. Mm-hmm. Like in Vietnam, you talk to the people and they generally, you're like, why they don't agree with anything that is wrong with their country. And that's replicated. Unfortunately, my feeling is that, like the West where we're from, there's more reason to be worried because actually it replicates half the country's feeling. In the other countries, it's generally a dictator who's like, I'm going to do whatever I want. I feel like in our countries, it's half the country feels this way. And that to me is more scary.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. I don't have some, comeback on that. I also feel like that is something that I struggle with and that is, that's challenging. And, there's a lot of conversation around let's open our minds and let's give everyone a chance and hear their perspectives. And on one hand, I agree with that. We were just at Burning Man, and I freaking love Burning Man for so many reasons, but this isn't a podcast about Burning Man, so I'm going to limit it to the relevant point here, which is that Burning Man is full of so many serendipitous encounters, and not just like we're going to a taco party, but we discovered champagne snow cones on the way, but also with people themselves. And in part because it's this liminal space. And so you can create the persona that you want to be while you're on the playa, the desert where Burning Man is built, right? And I was having a conversation with a gentleman a couple years ago, and it was an extensive conversation. It was like an hour long, and only an hour into it did we sort of get around to, so what do you do in the real world, like when you're not doing this whole Burning Man thing? And the guy asked me, have you seen the TV show Scandal? And I was like, wait, with Kerry Washington? He was like, yeah. And I'm like, this is going to be cool. I loved the first 2 seasons. It got a little soap opera-y for me, but like this guy works for Scandal. I'm probably going to meet Kerry Washington. It's going to be great. And he's like, yeah, so I'm a Republican campaign strategist. I'm like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, so like, Kerry Washington, like her crew, like Scandal, I'm like her, but for Republicans. Like I help Republicans get elected and stay elected and be in office. And I was just like, wait, come again? Like I really thought he was kind of pulling my leg at first. And it became clear very quickly that he was not pulling my leg and it was real. And I was like, okay. So you're a Republican, but you're a raver or whatever? And he was like, yeah, you could say that. And I'm like, I mean, I don't want to push. I'm just curious. Like, I don't know, like, have you done like illicit drugs or anything? Like, or what?
Yeah,
and he's like, yeah, I just popped a Molly like 30 minutes ago. And I was like, well, this is explaining why this conversation is going so well. One.
Yeah.
But two, I was like, okay, so this reframes my entire perspective in 2 ways. One, if I was at a dinner party and someone introduced themselves as a Republican campaign strategist, I'm going to smile, say nice to meet you, and then do everything I can to avoid talking to them for the rest of the dinner party. Because I'm going to immediately make this decision that, like, I have a short amount of time. This person is not my people. Why would I engage with them when there are probably, even if there's only 2 other people at the dinner party, there are probably 2 other people who I could make a better connection with. But that just wasn't the case, right? So, and that's the other thing, is that I think that it's hard to accept the fact that we can actually have an engaging, interesting conversation with people who have fundamentally different beliefs than us. And we didn't get into the politics side of things, right? Like we had a conversation, that swam in loads of circles that probably made sense at some points and didn't at others. But we were just having fun and engaging with each other as the individuals that were there seated next to each other without making it about this belief system. Now, I also struggle with this because, at what point do you draw the line? Like if he clearly was not. He had a different political party than me, and that's all. But, like, what if he was just like, I'm a skinhead or I'm a Nazi? Like, at what point do you go, like, your beliefs, I'm no longer, because of the person you are, I'm no longer interested in your beliefs. Like, I don't know how to draw that line or where that is.
For me, it's always how far are they willing to talk about it? The point for me where I personally draw the line is where someone isn't willing to budge at all and holds quite hurtful points of views and is like, no, I don't care, because, and I actually had this recently. We're house sitting in the UK at the moment, pet sitting, and we had dinner with someone and they'd voted Brexit, and when I tried chatting to them about it, they were like, yeah, but it means more money for me. And that's the end of the conversation. That's kind of where I draw the line. I'm like, okay, well, if it's just selfish and you're not willing to talk about it, I'm kind of done.
Have you read the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt?
I haven't, but I'm writing that down.
Okay, write it down. So the subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And he basically starts the book out by saying, through my research, I have realized that I'm a liberal bigot. Because bigotry, that's just, this intolerance of people who have, different opinions or different perspectives.
For sure, yeah.
And so you can be, just as much as you can be a conservative bigot, you can be a liberal bigot. And he goes in and kind of defines, like, the thing that's interesting is he basically says the way this manifests in politics a lot, but the way that we think about morality and ethics is a huge part of what defines our political beliefs. So one of his questions, which I'll ask you, is imagine that a guy buys a chicken. He buys a chicken from the store and it's dead when he buys it. And he goes home and he decides to fuck the chicken. Now, nothing happens from him fucking the chicken. He doesn't get a disease from it. He doesn't feel guilty afterwards. He doesn't think he's going to do it again. He's kind of just like, one-time thing. It was cool. That's it. Is that guy, like, is what he did, are his actions morally wrong? Why or why not?
For me, nothing that he's done's wrong. Which might surprise you because I know that a lot of what I say sounds very left field. I'm more interested in the conversations. I'm more interested in hearing why people have right-wing beliefs. That's more what interests me than their actual belief.
Well, I'm just curious, like, if there was someone who was arguing that it was morally wrong,
okay,
what would be your sort of description of why you think that morally or ethically he has not done something wrong? Like, your justification.
No one and nothing has been hurt other than people being offended.
Right. So this is what his book comes down to. He says, in the Western world, we're weird, which is an acronym: white, educated, independent, rich, and democratic. And a lot of social studies, like studies of, psychology and sociology, not just like social studies from elementary school, a lot of social-based studies are done on weird people, which skews the results. And he says, basically, in the Western world, if you are a liberal person, you hold on to one foundational value for your ethics and morality, which is do no harm. So I agree. Like, am I a little bit weirded out by the guy fucking the chicken?
Of course.
Yeah. It doesn't sit well with me. I'm like, can someone talk to him? Like, does he need help? Is he like, struggling? But morally or ethically, I'm not challenged by it because I also hold that same belief to be true. Do no harm. But if you start talking to a lot of people in like the Eastern world, for example, they fully believe that it's like morally and ethically wrong. And even when you come back to like, if you ask them why, and I might be like paraphrasing obviously a lot from his book, but what he kind of asks people why, and some people are like, well, it's embarrassing to his family. And it's like, well, no one ever found out about it. Okay, well, it's embarrassing to him and his family to God. And I think that's sort of one of the big barriers and why people are divided by politics and religion too, is, if you start to bring religion into it and a higher power and someone who is all-knowing and all-seeing, then there's a lot more room for shame and guilt. And these things all tie back to the morality and ethics as well. So I thought that book was a very interesting perspective because it made me realize that the way in which I'm judging politics and political actions morally, it's not that the people who have a different perspective are immoral. It's that the foundations for our morality and ethics are different.
And I'm so glad you've said that, because I got brought up in a very, very religious family and got disowned from it because of my points of view. But part of what I did was try and disprove them for a long time, actually, to try and walk away with it without them hating me. I wanted to actually be like, you're wrong, I'm right. And I wasn't able to do that because of what you've just said, because belief is something that you can't fuck with it. Like, you can't fuck with something that someone's like, yeah, okay, but I really believe this and there's nothing you can say that changes that.
Well, it's called faith.
Yeah,
right?
Faith. Yeah, it's like, it's ridiculous to someone that doesn't understand it. And I met my dad recently and I said to him, I know you don't get what I do, but I don't get your faith. That to me is something I'm like, I can't grasp it.
Yeah, and I think, my family is pretty religious. Well, my mom certainly is. And I grew up going to church every Sunday and was confirmed and all of that sort of stuff. And I think, yeah, I struggle with this idea of faith being this complete trust in someone or something. Like, for me, my faith is rooted in science. And I like the logic and the framework of the beliefs that show me why something is true. But that being said, I've seen so many people gain value from religion that I also have a hard time poo-pooing it. I do think it's really hard though, because when you think about religion as, you know, this blind faith in some senses, blind faith in things doesn't set you up to be in this world where we have media that gets to choose what they publish, and there's an epidemic of fake news and people reading headlines rather than the details. We could do with better media literacy, in my opinion. That should be something that we are teaching kids at school. Like, what's the source and what are they trying to communicate? If all communication is persuasion, that means that everyone has an agenda, including the people who publish an opinion. Why do they want you to think that this is true or not true? So that's my sort of bigger picture struggle with faith. I don't have a problem so much with religion in general, as much as I do have a problem with this idea of acceptance and indoctrination. I love the questioning and the challenging, and you know, you can only ever make a decision with the best information that you have at any given time. And you have to accept that over the course of your life, the amount of information that you have on any given topic, whether it's, you know, religion or work or life or politics or whatever, that's going to change. And it really fucks with your ego when that changes, because you have that, you know, ringing bell in your brain of, I was wrong. I wouldn't, if I had thought something was wrong at the time, I wouldn't have thought it, right? Because I would have had different information.
Yeah. Do you think that's how politicians are acting? Do you think they're replicating religion? Do you think people have faith in Trump or Brexit as opposed to have actually looked at facts?
I think there are a lot of different forces. I think one is, you know, if you look at the Russian model of propaganda and how news spreads and what confuses the people, there's definitely a lot of replicating of those models happening. You know, the fire hose of falsehoods is one interesting thing. I can't remember the guy's name, Vladimir something, and he's Putin's right-hand man. And one of the things that he does that's super interesting is he funds like neo-Nazis and he funds like super liberal save the world types.
Yeah.
And instead of making it secret, he like tells everyone that he's doing it, so no one knows where they stand. So I think there's like some of that sort of mischief happening. But then I think it's also that we live in a complex world. We do. There's so many things that affect each other that it's hard for our minds to comprehend just how complex the world is. And I think that in an area of complexity, humans crave simplicity. It's our natural state of just like, it takes a lot of energy. Like our brain uses so much energy. We could do with just a simple answer. And I think that's how you get to solutions like Brexit or the wall. It's a very simple way to quote unquote solve a complex problem. Will a wall solve immigration? Absolutely fucking not. But like, if you are thinking about a huge complex problem and you're just like, your brain is overwhelmed, I can see how something like that would be very satisfying to jump onto, especially if you don't have a larger context of the world and what works and that sort of thing. But I mean, even thinking about that, like, I think so many of our problems are global at this point, right? Like, so for example, taxes. When Google, you know, got a huge tax bill from, I can't remember if it was the UK or Ireland, and then they were like, like, fuck it, we don't really want to pay. Google's not even supposed to be that evil of a company. Like, their whole motto is do no evil or something, or don't be evil. And they're like, okay, instead of paying all of these taxes, we'll just move our company home base to another country where we can pay less taxes. It's like, if we have situations like that, like we live in a global world, but we keep throwing up borders, and climate control doesn't pay attention to borders. There's no fucking border patrol for pollution, you know?
I think I talk about this all the time, and I feel really torn apart by it, because it's very easy to hate on companies that get away with this stuff, right? And yet I'm never the person that wanted to do that. I'm never the person that wants to like hate on the person that's getting away with something. Surely the problem is the system, right?
Right.
Generally, we're just jealous. We're like, why can't I get away with that? Why does Google get away with that when I can't? That's generally the issue that people ask themselves.
I mean, I definitely ask myself that. I'm like, if Google and Facebook and I don't know, maybe Microsoft paid like the same tax rate as me and Faris, we could have, or Faris and me, sorry, mom, grammatical. We could have like single payer, we could have government sponsored healthcare in the US if just those three companies just paid the same level of taxes. Now, obviously, I understand that they employ people and there's a lot more nuance to the situation. But yeah, I've had those thoughts before too of like, I'm just the little guy. Like, one of my sisters, actually, my little sister, she was telling me that I can't remember where, but they're thinking about starting to tax robots for their worked hours. And at first I was like, no, that's bullshit. Like, robots should be, they're free, like free labor. And she was like, yeah, but think about that. Like, would you rather tax the robots that are being built and paid for by these massive companies, or would you rather tax the people who are coming in doing the minimum wage job thing? I'm like, oh yeah, let's.
And that's where
I was like, okay, now I'm leaning more towards taxing the robots and the people.
Do you like? I want to touch on this, and I was gonna start the conversation with this and be a total fanboy, but obviously I know that your integration into the kind of the branding business was with Jay-Z and Steve Stoute, which I am a massive hip hop fan. So obviously that to me is incredible. But do you think that helped shape your view of all these things? Because obviously hip hop has been monumental in shaping like people's view of the world and what's wrong with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I would actually, I would trace it back even a little further. So my dad is second generation music business. And I think that being in a family that sort of, like the music business isn't exactly fringe society, but it's definitely not the typical go to work in a corporate environment that a lot of people's parents had. So I think growing up, even just exposure to the fact that there were, you know, music video directors, there were choreographers, there were hairstylists, you know, growing up in Nashville, it's a blue dot in a bigger red state. But even when I was growing up, I feel like a lot of churches were torn on whether or not they were cool with people being gay. But in my family and in the music industry, it was like, well, duh, there are people who are gay and we don't think it's their choice. And you know, we accept them for who we are. So I feel like those sorts of things really started that, I don't know, maybe acceptance of challenging conventions, if you will, or of leading a non-conventional life. I mean, I would be hard pressed to tell you if you polled people who knew us. I'm not sure which is more of a challenge to conventions, living nomadically or the decision to not have kids, which we can like, you know, debate all day of like.
I'm sure Jane can talk about that a lot as well. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's just like those two things it's like they blow people's minds. But I do think, you know, working for Steve Stoute and Jay-Z was a huge part of what defined my career for sort of slightly different ways. One was just that I got used to very quickly a high-paced, high-stress environment that was, you know, exciting and exhilarating, but also you really were taught to stand up for your opinions and push for your ideas and beliefs and stuff, which was cool because we were a small company and because we were kind of, you know, Steve set up Translation when he had been working with Will Smith on Men in Black. I was like, not Bad Boys. That was too Men in Black. And so he has this label deal with Steve. And Steve was like, wow, you're just making so much more money from this deal with Ray-Bans that you did than from having a number one hit song that was in a number one hit movie and everywhere on the radio for forever. And so him saying like, okay, and we also know that when it comes to branding and pop culture and product placement, a lot of Black artists get shafted. People don't want to work with you know, people in hip hop because they're worried about the danger that it could be. It's like, okay, look, you're just as likely to get a DUI if you're a country music singer or if you're a hip hop artist. I don't have stats on that, but I believe that, it should be like comparable, right? So we were flying by the seat of our pants because Steve didn't have a background in creating a branding company. The idea was just like he and Jay-Z were like, okay, we can help create better partnerships. At the time that I started, or just before, Tiger Woods was featured in an ad for Buick. And no one believes that Tiger Woods drove a fucking Buick. Are you kidding me? Like, no way. So I think that, they had a lot of heart for, okay, let's figure out where people like, Mary J. Blige can fit into this world of branding, because it works for both the brand and the artist. Hopefully that was the idea, at least, is that it wasn't going to be about any artist selling out, but about buying into a future, a different kind of business model. Because if you're in the music industry, that as an artist, you're still at the whim of the label and the management team, etc., right? So when we did this project with Wrigley and Chris Brown, we had talked to a bunch of different artists who were not interested in working with us in this capacity, which was, we wanted to take Wrigley gum, which wasn't really being chewed by young people because Orbit had taken over. We wanted to remix the jingles because all of the jingles still had cultural relevance. People could sing them even if they didn't know the flavors of Wrigley gum.
Yeah.
So we had this idea, we'll remix these jingles. And we talked to a bunch of people and no one was really interested or didn't express a ton of interest. And we had talked to Chris Brown. This was before he beat the shit out of Rihanna. And he also was like, yeah, I don't know, like remixing a jingle sounds fine. We're like, okay, well, what would you be interested in? And I think that's like where the two-way conversation happens. And one of the things that I thought was super cool about translation. And in that conversation, we found out that he really wanted to do a dance track and that his label was not going to pay for a dance track and wanted it to be more poppy. And so we went to Wrigley, and now this is the time when it's really nice to have someone like a Jay-Z in your corner. And we went to Wrigley and said, like, hey, maybe we could pay Chris Brown to write a song. We could pay for whatever producer he wants. We could pay for whatever studio he wants, and you would have zero creative control, zero revisions, none of that normal stuff that you get on ad campaigns. But we'll give him the remit that he has to include the tagline, double your pleasure, double your fun, in, the song. And to me, that was part of what made it buying in versus selling out. Like, it wasn't like we went to Chris Brown with this list of, you have to do all of these things and you have to run it by us and all of this stuff. Instead, it was, what's something that you want to do? What's something the brand wants? How do we merge these together and, redefine what branded partnerships can look like? And it was great because we released a song, and I mean, it was number one for weeks. It had, people were dancing down their wedding aisle to this. So I think that sort of thing that impacts culture. Oh, and not to forget the key part of the whole marketing side of things, which is that Wrigley increased their sales like significantly. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but yeah, it was cool.
On your website, it says that you believe that brands can create and curate culture, and that really, really stood out to me because I just watched the documentary about when the Jordan Nike shoe was made and how much culture it influenced on Chicago and how people felt so connected to something for such, like, the first time in such a long time in that city. So it really struck a chord with me. So I love hearing this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's awesome too. I totally think that there's so much room for brands to add values to customers' lives. And I think part of the problem is just that we forgot about the value equation and as marketers, and we forgot that we have to give something in return. I don't know if you knew this, but Coca-Cola was the producer of the first Ghostbusters.
No,
They, talk about branded content. I mean, it goes back for forever. It's nothing new. It's just that, we have to think about the value exchange, and, in the digital world, we're taking a lot from consumers when we think about all the digital data and stuff that we collect. So we have to think about what is valuable in return. I mean, it's super simple and basic, but I've always loved how Target in New York and LA and a bunch of cities does, I think it's First Fridays, where they have a free day to go to the museums for the first Friday of the month. I mean, just something as simple as that, I think, is a really great way to show that you value your customers, instead of just like retweet to give $1 more to some random charity.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Just give the money to charity.
Yeah.
You don't need to have a retweet to do it. Like, just do it. Have you watched The Good Place at all with Kristen
Yeah,
Bell?
I love The Good Place, yeah.
So I loved how in the latest season, and I mean, this is like a kind of spoiler if you're watching The Good Place, but I don't feel like it's so substantial. But if you do watch The Good Place, maybe just skip 30 seconds forward. But they basically say, like, even if you're buying an organic tomato, you're getting negative points because, yes, you bought an organic tomato, but it took a really long time to get there. Or the amount of the seeds that you bought were from some evil corporation. So I think that because our world is more and more complex, it is hard to see all of the good sort of chain of commands. Like, anything could be bad, but if you look for it, I mean, Faris and I always talk about how we believe gratitude is the foundation of happiness. And I do think there's something to be said for the gratitude practice of looking around. And I can't remember how some people do it, like starting your day and saying 3 things or something. Mine's a little more ad hoc, just all the way throughout the day. I'm like, oh my God, look at this gorgeous bush, or look at this gorgeous whatever. Like, if you look around and if you stop, and especially if you put your phone down, that's a huge barrier to us finding things to be thankful for. If you put your phone down and you look around, there is a whole lot to be thankful for. It's just about noticing.
It's so true. And I think a lot of what we've mentioned is highlighting the value that brands can bring to people, which is important because it's so necessary in the culture we're living in. But to encourage brands to do this, what value other than money, and I think there are other values, does this bring to brands?
I guess I would kind of go back to, like, all communication is persuasion. So every action that a brand takes, whether it's paying their taxes or deciding to go to a different country and not paying their taxes, or whether it's supporting someone like Colin Kaepernick, or whether it's, fighting for better maternity policies. I think all of these actions go back to the heart of brand and building up, this idea of what a brand is and what their beliefs are. And it's hard to quantify goodwill, but we all know that this is something that is really impactful to companies, and that the latter is also impactful as well in a negative way, right? I feel like, I don't want this to come across as advocacy for winging it, because I am a fan of data-led strategy, and I think it's really important to look at data points as well. But I also think that sometimes we get so caught up in measurement that we measure for the sake of measuring. Have you heard of Goodhart's Law?
I haven't, no.
Okay, so basically Goodhart's Law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And I guess it happened, or it came about, this law came about from in one of the wars, where they were asking a bunch of companies to make nails, like nails out of metal, right? So the companies had, like, a certain number of nails to make. And so they made these nails, but they were all super shitty, like very poorly made, not very well. So they came back and they were like, okay, new goal. It's not to make X many nails. You're going to be paid by the total weight of the nails that you produce. And so then one company just came back and made just like one ginormous nail and was like, okay, here you go. Like, it's unusable, but they reached the quote unquote goal. And I think a lot of times in marketing, let me give you an example with a former client of mine that was a diaper company, and we were doing something to celebrate moms, and it was all about getting people to pledge actions to take for moms. Now, that was the end goal, getting people to do actions for moms on Mother's Day, sort of thing. But we made a little video to explain this idea, this concept, the program, whatever. And all of a sudden, our client wants us to get 1 million views on the video. And we're like, okay, so if we want to get 1 million views on the video, we can. But if that's our target, then it's not a good measure of success, because all we have to do is then go buy those video views, right?
Yeah.
But overall, is that what we think the success of the program is? Like, why are we doing this program? What's the end goal that we want to take? It's like, well, we want people to take actions for moms, and it is going to be, you know, people self-representing data points. So we can either have, quote unquote, you know, what we know is true, people watching the videos, which really could be robots somewhere in another country anyway.
For sure.
Or we can have a sort of a less robust measure that's more aligned with our original goal. I think that we lose a lot of common sense, like an opportunity to see an OTS, like for magazines, that's also an opportunity to miss. And you have to acknowledge that when you print out numbers and put them in a report, that they're not, you know, bulletproof. Like, these are not 100% facts. Like, let's look at directionality instead of just a specific percentage point increase day to day. Let's look at, and I guess that's kind of what I wanted to tie back in a roundabout way to your original question about how something impacts a brand. Like, let's have a basket of key performance indicators, and instead of being so focused on what the numbers are week to week or month to month, let's look at directionality. That would be super important.
I really want to say to anyone that's listening that for me personally, this is such an important piece of information, because as someone who has to deal with clients, this is something you're constantly having to explain to people, like constantly, and having an example like the one you've just given is useful for everyone. And I really do think it is, because I do social media for clients, and when you're trying to explain to someone that people caring about their product is so much more important than the amount of likes or than the amount of followers they have, because that can be bought, that can be so difficult to explain to someone.
And thinking about it on a personal level too. So I met this young lady, and she had this graphic design sort of company with some like greeting cards she was making. And she was telling me, she was like, okay, so I know that it's important to have an engaged fan base. But at the same time, when stores are looking at whether or not they're going to carry my cards, they're looking at my Instagram follower count. So what's the right move? Do I just go ahead and pay for the followers, which I know are fake, but will help me get into stores? Or do I focus more on growing an organic fan base? And I told her, I was like, you know what? In this instance, it might be better for you to just buy the fake followers, because what's your end goal? Like, this is the thing, is we have to think about, you know, strategy is about achieving an objective. It's as much about what we don't do as it is about what we do. So having that objective first and foremost is important. If your end objective is selling direct to consumers, then you want to grow an organic fan base. If your end objective is getting into stores, and you know that getting into stores requires a certain follower count, or that's going to be what gets you noticed, okay, so that's a different, you know, approach.
Okay, but what about, and obviously this is down to the brand, and some brands really do not give a shit, but what about future-proofing the brand? Then that has to come into play, because if you buy a load of followers and then Instagram changes something, you can be screwed over.
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, I think it's like, what's the end goal? Like, it really depends, because, and that's the other reason for the basket of KPIs too, because I worked with a brand who was trying to change their target audience, who they were talking to. They had been talking to moms. They wanted to be talking to millennials. So that was really interesting, because we weren't looking so much at sales data, because it's hard to know the age demographic of the people who bought your everything, right? But instead we were looking at engagement on social media. And it wasn't even looking at just the engagement rates, but it was looking at how many more millennials were we connecting with month or over month. And that was a very different goal to measure. When I worked with Green Giant, their frozen veg, I loved working with them, because their goal was get people to eat more vegetables. Now, as a market leader, that makes sense, right? Because if you're a market leader and people eat more vegetables, then they're going to be eating more of your vegetables. But what a, you know, admirable goal. Like, that was such a fun brand to work on, because at the end of the day, it was, how do we get people to eat more vegetables? That's such an interesting challenge to think about, such an interesting objective to try and map out a strategy for, instead of, such a, I don't know, a more narrow-minded perspective.
No, that's great. And those are the clients you really want, and the projects you really want to be working on, the ones that kind of push you to have to, I'm going to say, to create something new, but keeping in mind my next question, which is the last thing I'm going to touch on, because I know we've once again sped through the time that I had planned, which means I would obviously love to at some point meet you both and get to keep on chatting, because I've got so many more questions.
Sure.
But I do want to touch on, everything we've talked about involves a lot of things that you've learned, a lot of people you've worked with, and things you've seen. But the brand that yourself and Faris have built, this Genius Steals, encapsulates looking at things that you've seen and not copying them, but taking on board what's good from that and not being lazy with it, right?
I mean, you just did a perfect elevator pitch. So let's just record that, and that can be our soundbite from here on
Excellent.
out. Yeah, I mean, we believe that originality is a myth, that nothing comes from nothing. You can't invent things without inventory, though. So part of the reason we're traveling and exposing ourselves to so many different kinds of thinking and ideas and places and cultures is to get that breadth and depth, and to, take all of these things into our head, and ultimately at some point, hopefully use them, call on them, remix them, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, and we're looking at what's the best out there and how might this better apply to people's businesses. But yeah, copying, we always say the same is lame.
That is so good. And do you have a kind of guideline that you use to be like, this is copying, this is not, this is taken as inspiration, or do you, or advice for someone else?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's one very easy rule, which is, are you embarrassed to share your inspiration set or not?
That's great.
If you're embarrassed, then it's probably a little too close to what you initially saw. But if you can take the inspiration set and be like, this inspired me to do X, Y, and Z, and I feel totally comfortable showing you what inspired me to get there, that to me is great. Like, I don't know if you remember Pharrell when he did his video Happy, and it was like 24 hours of dancing through the streets.
Yes.
And I looked at that video and I was like, wow, this looks very similar to this Kickstarter that I funded, years prior, called Girl Walk All Day, where there's a girl who dances through the streets nonstop to the entire album of MGMT. And when I started Googling, I mean, if you Google, pull it up, there's a frame by frame Pharrell's Happy versus Girl Walk All Day. And I mean,
Wow.
They do the same, like, there are so many side by side shots that are just the exact same. So that to me is, more copying than stealing.
Yeah,
because
that's
you
lazy.
look at it and you're like, it is the same thing. That doesn't mean I dislike the idea. I think the idea overall of the 24 hours of Happy and dancing through the streets, if they had transformed it a little bit more, I think they could have pointed to Girl Walk All Day and said, like, oh, this was our inspiration. Someone dancing through the streets all day,
That would
nonstop.
be great, yeah.
Okay, perfect. You did it. But when you have side by side same shots, that tells me that you got a little artistically lazy, because you couldn't have accidentally made it that close to that, right? Like, there's just too many similarities. So that's sort of our personal rule of how we think about it. Like, if you're not embarrassed to share your inspiration set, then that would be a good rule of thumb. It's so important when we're in positions of power, which we all are, because we have the internet and we can publish,
it's true.
right? In just a second, to lift up people who have inspired us and or who help make our work better. I think that's just so important. When I was working at 360i, I got to work on Oreo.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, so we had, the tweet that broke the Super Bowl, and everyone who was in the room at the time got listed on the award entry. And we got so much shit for it around the industry. It was like creatives from like agencies that I like a Wyden and Kennedy being like, oh, how many people does it take to write a tweet? It's like, look. It's not about how many people it takes to write a tweet. It's about lifting up everyone who is a part of this process.
Yeah.
And Brian Eno, he defines collective genius as what he calls scenius, the intuition of a scene. So things that happen at like 3M or, at Pixar, these sorts of moments of collective genius, if you will. What are the conditions for them happening? And he lays out a few things. And one of the things is mutual respect and appreciation, which is obvious, but another one, sharing rapidly exchanging tools and techniques. But a big one, which is one of my favorites, is distributing credit. And I think that's something that as people get older, especially in the creative and marketing worlds, it's like you see so many creative directors listed on an award entry. Okay, cool. Like, how involved were you? Did you sign off on the idea, or were you actively involved in the development? And if you look at something like any digital piece of work, just how many people are involved in the success of that work? It's like maybe one person ideated, came up with this. Maybe there was one person who was the script writer, another person who's a videographer, another person who's a director, the content strategist, the social strategist, the people who are actually writing, the community management posts day to day, the developers, they're the engineers. And why do we have such a block against acknowledging that the lone genius is a huge myth and that we can celebrate everyone involved? That's one of the things that's continuously baffled me, is I don't understand why it's such a big deal to celebrate and lift up everyone who was involved, because a small contribution could have been the critical thing that made or break
the most important thing in it. Myself and my partner talk about this all the time in relation to films, because we know directors so well, and generally the thing that we take away from the film is maybe the costumes in it or the makeup in it, and that's what's made the film. Yet we could never remember who the costume designer was or the makeup artist was. We remember the director, and
right.
And that's kind of what we like doing in our society. We like giving credit to one or two people, and everyone else works underneath them and kind of gets the dribbles of what comes down.
Yeah, and I think that we can set ourselves up for more success by just continuing to lift other people up, whether it's because they're involved in work that we're proud of and that we want to celebrate, or whether it's because we see something else that is really cool. I mean, jealousy is an interesting emotion, right? Because sometimes we feel jealous of individuals, but sometimes we feel jealousy of the work that an individual has created, and that jealousy can inspire us to get our creative juices flowing. So I think all of that's important.
And I think that literally you've just described why I was so excited to talk to yourself and Faris, because honestly, I haven't even had a chance to touch onto all the amazing stuff you've both done. And
thank you.
I do feel so proud to have got to talk to you both, and I hope that we can talk more, because I relate so much to everything you say, and I honestly look up to you both as models of what I've been striving my whole life to do. I think you're a beautiful example of people who have done a really amazing thing. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. That was such a kind compliment. Can you write that on my LinkedIn profile or something? No,
of course I can. Anytime. Well, Rosie, thank you again. And a big hug to Faris from me. It's been lovely chatting to you.
I will. All right. Cheers.
I really hope you enjoyed that episode. I absolutely loved talking to Rosie. All the links for Genius Steals are below. Also the links to our sponsors for this episode, Nextant, who are a wonderful company, and the links to our social media accounts so that you can follow us elsewhere and keep up to date with all our latest episodes. If you did enjoy this, please give it a like, give it a share. If you're listening through Apple Podcasts, leave us a review. It all really helps and keeps us really, really, really encouraged. Thanks, and as always, Catch you next time.
Basically, Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. There's so much room for brands to add values to customers' lives, and I think part of the problem is just that we forgot about the value equation.